Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks for all of you for coming out. I'm sorry it's a little crammed in here. We'll try to entertain you. But on the other hand, I'm actually really psyched to be in the store. I had time to check it out. I really like the vibe. There's something really happening here in Oakland, and a lot of I look over at the phrase post-traumatic colonial stress syndrome, and I'm like, okay, we got the right vibe going on here in terms of acknowledging the precarity of the moment. So what I want to do is introduce my book, Hi Weirdness, just briefly, and read a few short excerpts, and then also introduce my longtime friend RU, and then he'll be interviewing me. He's got some really dynamite, appropriately political questions, both for our moment and for the store, and for what this book ended up really being for me, because it's based on my dissertation that I got. I got a degree in religious studies just a few years ago, and I worked on this material for my degree, and I was really interested in a couple of different questions, and I'll just lay out the questions and then read a couple of excerpts. One was just what happened to these three dead white guys in the 1970s, when in the case of two of them, they took a huge amounts of psychedelics over a good period of time, a third of whom sort of had similar kinds of experiences, but on the natch. These three people being Terence McKenna, who's later famous in the 1990s as a kind of mushroom bard. Robert Anton Wilson, not as well known as he should be, a very influential character in the underground, and someone who really influenced, probably of all three of these guys, the one who influenced RU and I the most in terms of our politics and metaphysics and prankster love. And the third being the famous Philip K. Dick, again, who was not so much a psychedelic person. He did take them, they did influence him. He was more of a speed freak, but by the time he had his extraordinary sort of religious experiences in 1974, he was largely drug-free. But his experiences resonate in very interesting ways. All three of these experiences resonate a great deal. There's overlaps and similarities and synchronicities that make one wonder what's going on here. And that's sort of my second question, which is what's going on in the early 1970s. We think about the counterculture as sort of a 1960s phenomenon that kind of trails and transforms in the 1970s. But for me, it's really important to demarcate 1970 or 71 as a kind of hinge point when things really start to change in really dramatic ways that in many ways are much more influential than the specific things that happened in the 1960s, though they're more romanticized and more remembered. So I was really interested in what can we say about the counterculture in the 70s? What are the forces in the 70s? How do we navigate it, and how does it resonate with our world today, which I think it does in many ways. And kind of the third question was, in laying out these extraordinary experiences in their time and place, how do we think about them? How do we think about these experiences that are in some ways related to what we would traditionally describe as religious or mystical experience, but in other ways are clearly sort of, well, psychotic, bizarre, or weird, deeply weird. And so partly what I do is develop the idea of weirdness as a way to understand a very ambiguous, kind of ambivalent set of experiences, associations, ideas, mythologies, science fictional possibilities, and really want to draw attention to it because I think they actually have a lot of import. And again, as much today as before. And indeed, one of the interesting things about having this book come out is when I was writing it, I was really immersed in the time. I was really thinking about how to be true to these characters and the texts they wrote and the questions that I was bringing to this particular time and place. But since it's come out, and I've been giving talks and being interviewed and doing tons of podcasts, and it's been really fun, but what's really interesting is how the meaning of the book has changed for me, and it's become more about what's going on now. It's more political than I thought it was, and the implications are kind of different. They're sort of less about this question about religion that really drove me, and a little bit more about what do we do with altered states of consciousness, and what do we do particularly with altered states of consciousness at a period of technological acceleration, the meltdown of consensus reality, the breakdown of capitalism and this sort of, crazy free-for-all that we're surfing or trying to surf today. So it's ended up being very resonant. And I just wanted to read one short passage that really kind of speaks to, if you want to say, the kind of metaphysics of the book, or where I'm actually coming from, not in terms of all the specific questions, but a kind of fundamental attitude towards reality that I want to abide within, and not to simply take an academic or scholarly or merely historical perspective. So in this book, I will describe an autonomous otherness lurking in the margins as the outside or the beyond. Two terms I am happy to leave perfumed with mystery and only vaguely defined, like fingers pointing at a moon obscured by clouds. The suggestive haze is part of the point. We may think about the world in itself in idealist or materialist terms, as an icon or an index, as a deeply unconscious source of microperceptions or an external chaos that our brains organize on the fly. But however you slice it, the theoretical openness that I describe as being modeled by William James demands that we invite the outside in, cracking the door to a beyond that is, at the very least, capable of agitating the membrane that always bounds our talk, our concepts, and our awareness. The doors of perception, cleansed or not, may never open into a truly separate reality. But even if we are permanently locked inside the accidental fences of the symbolic order, or a set of Kantian categories that forever separate us from the thing in itself, there remain twilight zones where the veil is thin, where, as William James puts it, the fence is weak and fitful influences from beyond leak in. Anomalies, synchronicities, marvels, ecstasies. These are facts of experience that we need to deal with, and not just by automatically reducing them to features of reality we already understand. From within our mental and social constructions, so solid-seeming and yet so flimsy, we can learn to detect traces of what Philip K. Dick, or one of the voices he heard, called perturbations in the reality field. And the other section I would like to read is one that reminds me the most of my longtime friendship with RU Sirius. And RU's an interesting character because he's done a lot of wild and wonderful stuff. He's got a crazy name. He did this crazy countercultural magazine. He's associated with the weird and the wild and the psychedelic and the intense and the erotic and the technological, all this kind of stuff, which is all true enough. But for me, he's always been one of my go-to intellectuals in this zone, with always possessing an immense amount of sanity and political coherence about the strange subcultural universes that he and I have moved in and out of for decades now. And so to kind of introduce him, I'll just read a couple of paragraphs about the politics of, in this case, Robert Anton Wilson, but to some extent, all three of these guys, who are interesting politically because while they were very deeply countercultural, they were deeply hateful of the system and rallied and rambled against it and had various forms of political practice. None of them were typical men of the left. They all dallied with forms of anarchism or even libertarianism. And so their own politics are kind of interesting, but I think they also shed light on some of the currents of the counterculture that we understand less of today. So the question I'm asking here is about Robert Anton Wilson, or where I'm starting with Robert Anton Wilson and the Discordian movement that he was sort of associated with, which was a radical anarchist, very tiny, but in the end, very influential group on the American underground in terms of their sort of metaphysical parody politics. They're sometimes thought of as a kind of anti-religion or parody religion, not unlike the Church of the Subgenius, a better-known group that really follows in their footsteps with overall less bite, but also a great deal of fun. So what kind of politics is this exactly? In her book, Anti-Disciplinary Protest, the social historian Julie Stevens argues that the dominant view of 60s activism today, including the usual distinction made between the fists and the heads, this is the usual historical distinction. There were the radicals, the new left over in Berkeley agitating, then there were the hippies and the freaks and the lifestyle dropout, psychedelic, new age, proto-new age counterculture and the hate, and that's the two kind of sides of the story that we usually hear. But that this distinction ignores the important presence of what she calls anti-disciplinary politics. This style of protest rejected hierarchy and leadership, offering instead a colorful psychedelic politics of satire that was, quote, distinguished from the new left by its ridiculing of political commitment, sacrifice, seriousness, and coherence, unquote. This third rail included the diggers, the yippies, and the folks that Jerry Rubin dubbed Marxist acid heads. Such anti-disciplinarians were behind a number of classic protest spectacles of the era, including the attempted levitation of the Pentagon, which Wilson attended, the Yippie campaign to elect a pig for president, and Abbie Hoffman's release of Cash at the New York Stock Exchange. Unfortunately, like too many historians of 60s politics, Stevens ignores the influence of American anarchism on anti-disciplinary protest, especially from individualistic or even right-wing libertarians like the Discordian Carrie Thornley and, to a degree, Robert Wilson. And it's easy to recognize the Discordians in her portrait of countercultural 60s that was highly self-conscious and media-wise, full of self-parodic gestures, drawing extensively on motifs from popular culture for its language of protest, and distinguished by its spectacular refusals of so-called Enlightenment rationality. Stevens ties this sort of slap-happy media politics to the subsequent emergence of postmodernism, which she sees as kind of destroying and deconstructing the realist politics of solidarity into sort of self-conscious image play. But I don't think that the Discordians and many of their fellow metaphysical radicals were simply relaxing into the relatively safe circuits of postmodern media parody. For some anti-disciplinarians, the rejection of the secular materialism of the New Left militants did not lead to an ironic nihilism, but rather to the rejection of a nihilism perceived within secular rationality. The Frankfurt School attacks on instrumental reason and the barbarism of the Enlightenment were read by some young radical intellectuals as an invitation to place their bets on a different ontology entirely. One more paragraph here. To her credit, Stevens recognizes that paradox and incoherence were specifically political tactics for anti-disciplinarians. But her focus on irony and mediation obscures the ontological and even esoteric sources that some activists glimpsed and grasped through their public chaos rituals. So while Stevens underscores the social critique that motivated anti-disciplinary politics, she entirely misses the aesthetic world building, to say nothing of the religious twist introduced by psychedelic mysticism. As Christian Greer explains, the yippies were not just mockers, but also practitioners of psychedelic militancy. Inspired by the Dadas and Surrealists, they, quote, orchestrated media hoaxes, street theater, and bold demonstrations of love that were designed to effect a permanent change of heart in their opponents. Instead of conquering their foes, the yippies aimed to convert them by blowing their minds into a higher order of awareness. So those are the kinds of thoughts that are stirred up by RU, one of whose books precisely looks at the counterculture and these anti-disciplinary trends. So with that, I'm very happy to be here with my old pal. Sorry about the crackly cord here.
Is this okay? Can people hear me all right? So yeah, I'm interested in you're raising the Discordian spirit at the start of this, and this whole sort of playful attempt that occurred in the 1960s and 70s across the 20th century, really, to storm the barricades of the mind, storm the barricades of perception And as I'm working on the Mondo 2000 book, I was looking at 1968, and I think there's like a distinction between the yippies who were at the barricades, and the Discordians in some ways was a way to back away from the barricades, to say, no, we don't have to storm the barricades, we can storm the barricades of the mind instead. And I mean, there's no way to replay history and know whether people like Bob Wilson and those folks just saved people a lot of cracked heads and, you know, nasty occurrences that if they had stayed at the barricades might not have led to fruitful results anyway. I want to also talk about the early 1970s and the 1970s in general. You mentioned 70, 71 as a time, sort of the turning. And I really think of 1973, 1974 as the moment when a whole bunch of us, I was there, I was a 21-year-old freak, looked around and said, oh shit, I'm gonna have to deal with this thing the way it is, wage slavery. It's not gonna be a psychedelic culture. We're in Oakland, you know, UEP Newton is not gonna be the you know, commander of the Central Committee of the revolution. The revolution, the transmutation, the transformation was not about to occur at any moment. So I guess I've asked two of my questions at once.
Sure, that's a problem.
Yeah.
No problem. Let's start out with the first one. I think you're definitely pointing to you know, a fundamental tension, and there's two things to say about it. One is I was thinking about something similar about Terence McKenna, because he talked about when he was at Berkeley in the mid to late 60s, you know, he was a protester. He was on the front lines and hanging out with the, you know, the crazy anarchists and protesting. And then he has a line in True Hallucinations where he talks about, well, you know, this is in the early 70s. That didn't really work. Maybe there's another way to change reality. And so from one perspective, it looks totally different, like dropping out of concrete political action and entering into the metaphysics of psychedelics and the navel-gazing world of inner experience. But there is another way of recognizing how there can be a continuity in motive for people who shift between one and the other. And historically, we may judge it as being ineffectual, but I think it's also important to make room for the coherence and continuity of that intention, rather than looking at it simply as like an escape or a rejection of politics. The other point is that Bob Wilson himself is an interesting guy because he was in Chicago in 1968. So he saw the heads getting busted. And in a way, the best set piece in Illuminatus, the book he published in 1975 with Robert Shea that really, you know, catalyzed a lot of high weirdness, both in his own life and in the underground. The best part of it in the first book is this long piece that takes place at the Democratic Convention. And again, one of its themes is like, maybe the problem is with rationality itself. And so that's where the Dada thing and the surreal thing is, that the ability to break down rationality in ourselves and in media and in social reality had a chance of actually creating the room to make something actually happen. Now we can look at that as essentially ineffective. Maybe it sets in motion postmodern politics, maybe it sets in motion a lot of cultural movements that are really great, fascinating spiritual developments, even developments in philosophy. I mean, postmodernism itself arises in the 1970s out of these very circumstances. So the very terms that people come to think about these things come out of this wrestling and an attempt to sort of elide or deconstruct the kind of claims of rationality. But from our place right now, it's a more stark distinction, I think, in terms of what does action look like and what does a sort of we see more irony than was necessarily there, because from our perspective, these moves are more familiar ways of kind of disengaging or putting quotes around things. But they weren't necessarily there for the folks at the time. I also agree with RU about the central importance of 73, 74. For me, 1970 is the beginning of a turn. You have Kent State, and the paradox that even though Kent State was a real nadir, that somehow even the anti-war politics, which were in some ways the broadest of all the social movements that were going on at that point, as you had more specific movements arising with Black Power, obviously huge, and then the emergence of women's liberation and Native, and American Indian movement and things. There was a broad consensus that the war was terrible, and yet following Kent State, the mass energy of demonstrations began to wane, and it waned partly because the man was interfering. We'll never understand. You can't look at history that way. We'll never really understand the degree to which the malfeasance and dirty tricks of the FBI and the CIA were undermined what could have been a more robust response in this period. We'll never know. But it's certainly the case that somewhere along the line, and it's great if you talk to 60s, people who are really in the 60s, ask them, and they will almost invariably tell you about some day. It's like some day, like I woke up in 1974, and I'm a dealer, and I'm doing Tai Chi, and I realize that it ain't gonna happen. The revolution, political and or consciousness-based, is just not going to happen. And that they had been riding this possibility, even in the face of so much difficulty and so much suffering, so much awareness of the deep institutional and systematic problems. There was this energy of possibility that closed, and it really kind of did close. And what's so interesting about particularly 1973 and 1974 is that I think this is when it really closes, when people are really like, oh, we're not getting out of this anytime soon. And it's an incredibly vital time, a dark time, but incredibly vital time. I mean, the music that comes out in 1973, 1974, but especially 1973, just like bam, 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 like amazing stuff. So there's this moment of creativity and this moment of kind of despair. And what do we do? And that really is a kind of a significant hinge point.
Right, and there was this tremendous explosion immediately after Kent State, which looked like it's almost a culmination of what was happening in the 1960s. And it relied on college students. And it relied on college students mostly that were in very privileged university systems. And, they got very angry in May. Cambodia was bombed. People were shot at Kent State and at Jackson State. Banks were burned. Schools were closed. The streets were in chaos. They went home for the summer. And they probably took a look around, particularly these kids from very privileged social strata, and they looked at their parents and they thought, well, I don't have to do this. I have re-entry into the system. And I think a lot of the quiescence that occurred immediately after 1970 was really based on the fact that it was the mass explosion was really based on college students, more so than street people, et cetera. So that's part of that. And then you get, I think you're right. You get to 73, 74, that's when the door really closes. And I wouldn't use the term potential in terms of how we were thinking about things when I was in high school in the 1960s and then also at the beginning of the early 70s. Hunter Thompson used the term certainty. That we knew that we were at the crest of, what was it, the glorious wave or whatever that famous Thompson quote is. We were certain of it. And then in the early 70s, that starts to get a little, maybe not, but you're kind of clinging to it. And then 1973, 1974 becomes that thing. And I think that Wilson's whole Chapel Perilous experience takes place in 73, 74. Philip Dick's sort of pink beam experience takes place in 1973, 74. And I think that you have to look at that in the context of desperation, the end of the collective hope. And these fellows, Timothy Leary also, sort of taking personal responsibility to go out as explorers to the frontier and try to bring back, some kind of magic that could still make transformation. So those guys, those three guys, were sort of like explorers, disconnected in some ways from the broader sense of counterculture unity, which by 1973, 74 was gone. I mean, I think it was more present in the 90s than it was in that particular moment.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really true about what they were doing. And one of the intensifications, one of the places they found is through technology. And that's something that's really interesting in terms of both of our histories with Mono 2000 and with Technosis, which was really came out of a related spirit. And all three of these guys had very interesting relationships to technology and to the futuristic, fantastic, transmutational powers of technology in different ways. So, Phil Dick's a science fiction writer. Sure, he imagines a lot of dark dystopias, but his whole visionary experience is very much about technical mediation, about computers, about networks, about network minds. And Wilson and McKenna both were very interested in the future and in the transformative arc of the acceleration of intelligence, the acceleration of networks, the acceleration and miniaturization of components, and a lot of going into McKenna's sort of archetypal thinking. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that for him, like the emergence of solid state components was part of this larger alchemical story of technology that was going to get so miniature that we were going to be able to sort of live in an archaic reality, but all mediated by. Is there something we can do about that? Is it just on here or? Anyway, I guess that's what we'll live with it. Speaking of technology, the Gremlins never lets you do it without some noise on the line. So that's one of the ways in which they created this reality, and and in that sense, it represented something more broadly that was happening in California in particular in that time, which was the interweaving of the counterculture, of consciousness culture, and the emergence of the computer industry and the ideas of networks and the ideas of artificial intelligence. And it was a very strange moment in the kind of military history or the industrial history of the United States when the counterculture really had a significant, major influence on the development of new technologies that now are at such a, we've gone through many life cycles of this story through debasement, marketing hype, hypocrisy, and now we're in this like ridiculous late stage thing where like these Silicon Valley guys are still trying to squeeze the kind of utopian progressive dream out of what is so obviously this mixture of hyper-capitalism and surveillance technology, and the story. We don't need to spend that much time with it. But in any case, you can really see their own utopian visions as being related to this desire to find another way.
Well, this leads into something I wrote down, which is I'm struck that Wilson and McKenna made predictions about the future, and Philip K. Dick wrote fiction, but his fiction turns out to be more accurate. And of course, those two guys had big utopian projections of what would be the results of the kind of technologies that we have around us now. Also, many technologies didn't turn out to work. So, one of the things is that we've had the technology of communication, but we haven't had the technologies of wealth and production and so forth. There's a whole other thing to get into about that, but how would you reflect on that? That I mean, Philip K. Dick has an advantage because he was a fiction writer, and those of us who write essays, I've tried to back away from it. I prefer to write song lyrics now because I can't be blamed for anything and don't have to prove any points.
But it's very true. I think part of it as well was not just that he was writing fiction, is that the fiction let him pay attention to different aspects about reality, and in some ways he was more realistic about the way in which technologies always fail. There's always, as we have demonstrated right here, noise on the line. And this is true whether or not it's communication from a military organization to some, a person undercover or a cop, trying to understand the recordings that he's made of the surveillance targets, and there's distortion on the line. Or indeed, even if God is communicating to you. I mean, ultimately, that was Phil Dick's problem, is that he had a revelatory experience, real deal, mystical, religious downloads, but he couldn't quite make out the signal. And it's something that you see in some of his fictions. It's exactly what happens. The planet, in A Maze of Death, all of the colonists arrive at this colony and they have their instructions are sent to them from the God worlds, and the tape is garbled. So they're sort of left in this existential condition. And Dick was very, very aware of that particular existential condition of being hung up on the line or can't make out the signal and having to wrestle with noise. And in a way that reflects a very materialist way of understanding communications. And that's really important. And it's something that's true of all three of these characters, is while they were interested in big, supernatural, metaphysical, idealistic visions, they were also in their own ways all very materialist. They were very aware of actual physical reality, how it works, its limitations, its potentials, more or less how science works, more or less how technology works. And I think Dick was just much more savvy about understanding that technology always has this broken side. It's always leaking. It's always not quite right. There's always an update. The update doesn't work. It makes the other thing not work, and then you have to go over there and fix that problem, and then there's a solution that gets patched, but that creates another problem, and meanwhile, the whole thing is kind of running out of control and creating all this entropy, and there's just no way out. That's the condition. It's like the human condition, except it's the human technological condition. And he just was much more savvy about that in a way that I think both Wilson and McKenna, when they looked towards technology, they saw something cleaner and more with less noise on the line.
This actually brings me to something I was thinking about that really freaks me out. And that's that, I mean, I was working on the Mondo book. I was writing about living theater, Paradise Now, seeing their performance in 1968, I think, or 69. And I was thinking no young person today could possibly relate to this. And since then, in fact, while I was in the process of writing this stuff, you begin to hear people talking about post-scarcity again. There is this thing going around. It's small, but it's there. I think the phrase is fully automated luxury communism. And Mark Fisher, K-punk, writer from Britain, started writing a paper called Acid Communism, saying that not only, just like we were saying in the late 60s, early 70s, not only has a revolution come, it's inevitable. But then he committed suicide before he finished writing the book, so I don't know where that leads us. But it always amazes me that these kinds of things continually rise up. I was hired to edit a transhumanist magazine, which for which I perhaps should feel some shame, but I got to get Erik Davis in there. We had an interview with Jonathan Lethem. None of those people know who Jonathan Lethem is. It's like he's one of the three Jonathans of the apocalypse. But even there, when I started editing the magazine before the second issue, the economy collapsed, and I can't get away with this. Nobody's gonna nobody's going to believe in this anymore. But sure enough, there were those people who believe in that. And I mean, it emerges in various contexts and so forth, but it's still out there. So you want to speak to that peculiarity?
Well, I think what most interests me in what you were talking about is just about belief, where how belief works, how we insulate ourselves from reality through belief, what happens when we start to question believing, where the difficult place that leads us to. And one of the things I'm talking about with all three of these guys is they're kind of like failed models. They're models for something, for a certain way of thinking and being in deep mystery, where you start to question conventional belief systems. You move into a realm where other beliefs become possible: esoteric ideas, synchronicity ideas, paranoid ideas, conspiratorial ideas, and they have a certain magnetism, but you also don't really trust them either. So how do you navigate now in this world where you're not quite believing? And they all fell into belief. They all desperately wanted it in a way, and then in different ways resisted it and critiqued it. And I think that's part of one of the things that's so weird about now is that we can simultaneously be incredibly skeptical, have lots of data for our skepticism, pessimism even, cynicism even, and yet what we observe is this multiplication and intensification of belief systems that gain more and more traction. So QAnon is a great example, where you're like, this is obviously some kind of conspiratorial game. It's like something that like Robert Anton Wilson would make up in a book to be funny or make fun of something. And yet its gameability means that it fills in the tremendous anxiety that those of us who don't simply submit to belief experience by providing a belief, an explanation for another level. And this is, of course, the outstanding appeal of conspiracy theories. Not to say that some conspiracies aren't real, but the appeal of conspiracy theory as a mode of believing is very much about solving this problem of how do we think, how do we move forward. And what I talk about with these guys is this kind of tightrope walk, where you kind of maintain a sort of common sense or a certain kind of critical sensibility, even as the world around you or the situation you're in grows more and more kind of harrowing or even bizarre. But I think the good side of that, and the place where the acid communism conversation is really interesting, is just that in such a situation, there will always be the hope. There is always the hope. You can't keep it down that a different kind of model or set of beliefs about what is possible becomes so widespread that you can't hold back anymore. And it's maybe a thin, thread of hope to hold. You don't want to hang your whole expectation about the future on such a thread, but it also is, I think, a perennial reason to sustain hope and to also keep in touch with that, with the political possibilities of this sort of outside irrationalist potential, because it's only that way. If our reason is only going to tell us why, we're in calamity.
Right. You definitely can't apprehend reality only through logic. That is definitely a lesson of psychedelics and fiction writing and just everything to do with art. I think we've talked about crossing over into a different kind of reality in the early 70s and then in 74 and 75. And then we crossed over into another reality in 2016, 2017. I've coined the phrase Operation Mindfuck has been too successful, which has been repeated by a number of people. And of course, now we have this really bizarre, extremely vulgar trickster who is, central to our national discourse, really dominating it. And you have movies like The Joker and so forth. There's an increasingly dark tricksterism, particularly being at the head of many nation states, not just Trump. Where does that lead us in terms of the Discordian spirit and the Operation Mindfuck spirit of Robert Anton Wilson and so forth?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I for those of you who aren't familiar with Operation Mindfuck, it was sort of it started off in a way as a relatively small action that Bob Wilson and some other Discordians did. It's a long story. It's fascinating. It's almost unbelievable in its detail. But the short of it was that one of their one of the main Discordians was being harassed and was ultimately called to the stand by Jim Garrison, who was pursuing a conspiratorial possibility about the JFK assassination. And they found this, kind of sort of absurd. And they discovered that someone in Jim Garrison's office believed in the Bavarian Illuminati, that the Illuminati were actually controlling political reality. Now, little side note, we have to recognize that the United States of America has in its fundamental DNA paranoia about the Illuminati. The whole problem of the Illuminati, their relationship to Freemasonry, their relationship to Enlightenment politics, goes right to the heart of it. It's not just some kind of fringe thing. There was an anti-Masonic party in the early 19th century. These themes and motifs are actually shockingly boring and cliched in terms of what constitutes them and how they return again and again. So what they did at the time was say, okay, we're going to prank this guy by supporting his conspiratorial ideas by planting stories in different magazines and sending him things on letterhead and getting more and more people to distribute Bavarian Illuminati letterhead. And it became this kind of prankster, satirical, quasi-political, quasi-art project. And it was out of those ideas that then Wilson wove his book Illuminatus, which has the Illuminati centrally featured and is a very ambiguous organization, not just entirely evil. And so in many ways, a lot of our contemporary obsession with the Illuminati and Twilight language, and deconstructions of R&B videos where you show how it actually means that there's all this sort of secret, thing going on. And that's all very interesting stuff. And then some of those videos are deeply weird because it becomes like a feedback loop where the people making the videos start screwing with people, start mind-fucking people by planting traps for them to fall into, just the way QAnon is a trap that's clearly designed to mind-fuck people, to get people to believe something they wouldn't otherwise believe, and to get them to follow procedures that then take them off the map, basically. So all of this stuff, in a way, you can trace back to the Discordians. So as I was writing it, again, when I was writing it, I was just sticking in the 70s. I wasn't trying to, reflect about, and I was like, the more I did this, I was like, oh man, I mean, this is no walk in the park anymore. This is no lark, because these very same tactics, these very same sensibilities with a shift from, happy hippie anarchy to dark, manipulative chaos merchants, and chaos. I like aspects about chaos, but in that sense, I think it's appropriate disruption or the breakdown of social mores or the breakdown of consensus inside a complex society like ours. Obviously, the consequences of this are really, really negative, and I don't know how to think about it. Part of it is that it was always in part of the picture. It was once you open that door, that other stuff is going to happen at some level or another. I am shocked at how intense and bizarre and absurd and over the top and science fictional it is, how much like a Phil Dick story it is. In fact, it's actually kind of like there's a president figure in Radio Free album, if anybody's read that, that's very Trumpian. It's quite unnerving, actually. So in a way, it was sort of like part of the picture. Once you have an advanced society that figures this stuff out, you're going to make room for that kind of exploitation. But where does that lead us, who were sort of inheritors of these modes of politics and sociality? I can only throw up my hands and say it's confusing.
Yeah, there is an aggressive aspect to pranking. That's inbuilt to doing that. When you say when you're participating in Operation Mindfuck, what are you saying? You're saying I'm going to fuck with these people's minds without their consent. So it always had that peculiar edge to it. and of course it was great fun, but yeah, it was always a bit aggressive. Is there more stuff we want to say about this, or we want to move on to other?
How are we doing on time?
About 10 more minutes if you want to take questions.
Okay.
You want to take questions?
You have one final quick question thing, and then I can riff, and then we can take questions.
Yeah. Okay.
I bet you have one thing.
All right. Yeah. Let me ask this one. To do with the title of your book, the word weird. Today, the discourse is the distinctly neutral or even complimentary neuroatypical. And it is complimenting. Most people don't want to see themselves as typical. So what about that language of weird? Is it something that weird people embrace? Will it continue to be something weird people embrace?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think about that a lot. I think it's changing. A lot of the weird underground culture that I'm talking about in the book is now much more available. Conspiracy theories online, the strange ideas. We're increasingly interested in wider ranges of human behavior. We accept more room for it. There's more room for what we once called deviance until there's not really a norm anymore. But as that process happens, I think some of the charge of the weird, the sort of sacred charge of it as something that was contra or taboo even, gets dissipated. It's just like, the obvious place to see this is in formerly deviant sexual practices, which were once very taboo, and so therefore if you're participating in them, had a lot of charge. And then as they become mediated and turned into things that everyone's sort of doing, and you buy it, and there's a discourse of health around it and wellness, and we're just exploring our things. Yeah, it's fun, but it loses some charge, perhaps even some of its political charge. And I think we're kind of, both things are happening. We're losing a little bit of the edge at the same time as we're making room for just more flowerings of unpredictable mutations and exploration. So I think that the weird as something to kind of fetishize or to hole up with is dissipating, but in that process, there's a lot of room for new cultural artifacts, for new explorations, and indeed for really being able to accept and tolerate difference. If you're trained in the weird in this more classic sense, and you're walking the talk, you're just more accepting of much wider ranges of people, even things you don't know about, you are unexpected by. So I still hold out hope that it's part of what allows a more diverse culture to exist, where there's just more subject positions, there's more identifications, there's more ways that people organize themselves, and that's okay even if you don't know what it's about, because there's sort of a basic acceptance of alterity and the unfamiliar as something exciting, interesting, valuable, productive, part of what it means to be human. So I think I'll end on that note, and we have time for a couple of questions. Thanks so much for your patience. I know it's hot and crowded in here, so ask RU and I something. Thank you.
Ted?
So you guys both knew Terrence, and I want to ask something about a line from him that has always haunted me, which is, "Culture is not your friend." And I wonder how that is shook out in terms of both of your thinking on countercultural issues. But since we have the benefit of you both former friends of McKenna here, I'd also love to hear any anecdotes you might have about what you learned from him about psychedelic experience and personal conversation.
You want to start?
You can start.
Okay, well, I know half a dozen people who love that quote, "Culture is not your friend." I don't know what he meant, actually, to be honest. In my deepest moments of weirdness, I think that I am being contaminated by any kind of participation in the world, in the mediated world, in the world in general, and talking to human beings, being amongst human beings. So I kind of take that quote that way, that as a individual, I'm being brainwashed by any kind of intake whatsoever. And that's about the only way I can really relate to it. For me personally, I mean, when I went back to a reunion of my family back in the early 90s, that was okay. But then when I went to my hotel room and there was a special playing old Beatles songs on the radio, I was like, I relate to that more than I relate to my family. So culture was my friend. I've gotten to know some of these family members better since then. So apologies, if you see the video. But yeah, so culture, in that sense, culture was, what was Morrison, the music is your only friend until the end or whatever. Yeah.
I think I think that's a great response to that part of the question. In terms of Terence's own attitude, I think the thing that I learned from hanging around him was how multi-layered his belief system was. That in some ways he held some really kooky ideas very, very core, very deeply, and didn't really speak directly from them that often. And then depending on his sort of proximity to psychedelic experience, he would represent them in different ways. So as he the farther he got away from a big trip, the more it was sort of about history and who knows and possibility. The closer he was to a big trip, he was like, it's coming, kids, history is being sucked into this, and you'd get the sort of vision, as it were. And in a way, though we can criticize him as a thinker or as an intellectual for that reason, in a way it just made him more like a psychedelic experience, in the sense that that's sort of what like in the heart of the experience you can have like completely far out possibilities, and and if you keep your wits about you, the next day you're like, whoa, that was pretty far out, but I think I'm not going to quit my job, and we sort of modulate and we gain things from them, even though we recognize that in some ways the great visions were sort of kooky, and in a way dancing with his ideas was like playing with that kind of creativity.
Yeah, I would only add that McKenna, listening to him rap like in the early mid-'80s and so forth, really took me to a different level of paying attention to my psychedelic experiences, even more so than the many other psychedelic writers that I had read. And do people want to hear something cynical about Terence? Raise your hand. I'd say no matter how far out you think a public person is, he or she is also probably keeping real close track of their career.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's an important lesson I learned from McKenna, Leary, myself, anybody now.
No, that's true. Any other questions out there?
No?
Nothing? Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah.
So, on one frame, like when I spend a lot of time on the internet, I really feel this weird thing. Like things are getting really weird. And then when I'm like sort of walking around the city, and living my life, everything seems like pretty normal.
What?
Like there's food in the stores, and people like drive places, and like people have jobs. And when I think about, I guess I'm curious about your takes on this. Do you feel like the sort of normalcy of the physical world, do you feel like that's an overhang, like that we're just sort of spending down some surplus of like past civility? Or do you feel like actually this is sort of able to coexist in a stable way, Things keep getting weird, but...
That is a very, very interesting question. I often inhabit the tension of those two possibilities. Like it sometimes feels like we're still riding an earlier investment in collective social norms and consensus rules and sort of, operative models of how things operate. And there was so much energy and attention put into them that we're still kind of feeding off of them, even as the reality is actually much more chaotic, in your face, than we might think. And then there's another side of me that sort of thinks, and I tend to think this way a little bit more. I don't know whether because it has a kind of, I won't say hope in it exactly, but it's like is the idea that that part of human experience is kind of normalizing things to sort of a mundane, slightly irritating, vaguely pleasurable, kind of anxious okayness. Like you read accounts of like people in the concentration camps, and you're like, this is just an absolute unimaginable nightmare. And yet, people fell in love, they gossiped around about each other, they did little things, and it's not like they weren't living in horror, but there's this sort of way where there was a familiar humanity, social reality that gets played out particularly in physical space and interactions. And so I kind of feel like we carry it with us. And the interesting consequence of that is I sometimes imagine a very intelligent, forward-thinking person from 1650 who's like, has a sense of like how things might change and that the world is actually going to change and there's these machines and there might be more machines and they start to think, kind of science fictionally. And you pluck this person and put him or her in the city that you're talking about, the city you walk around and feel kind of, hey, it's just, happening. And they would just think we're fucking batshit crazy mutants. Like, what? This is insane with the things and the whoosh and the what? I mean, it's just unlivable. These guys are crazy. But for us in the inside, at least in the way that you're talking about, whatever, we're getting by, it's sort of annoying, but there's some cool stuff, meeting your friend, blah, 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 girl, da-da-da. That's something we do even as the situation gets extremely weird. And I think that's something to take a lot of not even just solace, but to actually affirm. And I really believe that the only way to sort of keep your shit together now is to reinvest at least some of your time in the local, in the physical, and community, and places, and the body, and nature, and animals, and dirt, and just dealing with your stuff, and all that kind of stuff. Those things, not necessarily because that's reality, but it's like the only ballast that's going to have. And people who get lost online and who just that becomes their thing, it's like in a way they're just sort of, they kind of lose the plot, even if they're really smart or even self-critical. So I think it's kind of both in a way, but I think that the dynamic you're pointing to is super key right now. So thank you.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, I mean, this happens in war zones now. The orchestra still plays, the cafe is still open, people still go through their various rituals, and always amazing. On the other hand, we've never been in a situation, as human beings, we've gone from 2 billion people to 7 or 8 billion people in like how many years? In my lifetime. 2.5 billion, I think, to 8 billion people, or close to 8 billion people in my lifetime. And as I understand it, half those people are online. So half those people are getting memes and tropes and signals that they have to cope with, lots of them. And we've never been in a situation like this. I think it's, in some ways it would be safe to say that a technological singularity hasn't happened, won't happen, but there's been a kind of a social singularity. We can't understand where we are now because of the vast numbers of people in this mediumized situation that the internet has brought forth, and how the incursion of all kinds of strange ideas and influences will affect how human beings act and how they live together. So people might actually get weirder and start to abandon some of those normalizing aspects. I don't know.
So how are we doing on time?
We're there.
We're good? All right, so I have an unfortunately small number of books, but they're some of the last hardbacks. The paperback edition is out this month, as well as the ebook. I think the ebook is actually going to be available tomorrow. So if that's your thing, there you go. But otherwise, again, thanks so much. Sorry I was kind of crammed, but I really appreciate the attention and everything.
Surveys.
Thanks to RU too. What's that?
Do you have surveys?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and thanks to Litquake. Super fun. And Wolfman.